You're listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast by the Moscow Times. This week, we're going to explore the largest protests that have taken place in Russia since the start of the war, as thousands of people have taken to the streets in a small town in the Ural region, sparking a wave of arrests and detentions. But first, here's a roundup of the top news stories from Russia this week. A Russian military plane that Russia says was transporting 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war was shot down over the Belgorod region near the Ukrainian border, according to both Russian and Ukrainian sources. Moscow's claim that Ukrainian prisoners of war were on board has not yet been independently verified. Neither have claims in Ukrainian media that the plane was carrying missiles for Russia's air defense system. Ukrainian military agencies have confirmed that a prisoner swap was due to take place, but said that Russia was responsible for protecting Ukrainian prisoners of war and that they would continue to target Russian planes in Belgorod region. On Thursday, the Ukrainian security services announced they would open a criminal investigation into the crash as a potential violation of the laws and customs of war. Thousands in Moscow and across the country have lined up to leave signatures in support of anti-war presidential hopeful Boris Nadezhdin. Nadezhdin needs 100,000 signatures from 40 of Russia's regions by the end of January to continue in the race. 60-year-old Nadezhdin worked as an advisor to Boris Nemtsov in the 1990s, when the late politician was prime minister, and served a single term in the State Duma 20 years ago. Though President Putin is still all but guaranteed to win the election, Nadezhdin's campaign, which has received the backing of leading opposition figures including Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Maxim Katz, and allies of Alexei Navalny, is a rare opportunity for Russians to demonstrate against the war. A bill that would allow authorities to confiscate the property of people convicted of spreading fake news about or discrediting the Russian army's actions in Ukraine has passed its first reading, in the latest move targeting critics of the war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree calling for the preservation of Ukrainian identity in regions of Russia that, according to the decree, historically had significant Ukrainian populations. It calls for Ukraine's cabinet to work with international experts to develop an action plan for preserving Ukrainian identity on Russian territory. Russian officials slammed the decree, which also entails the creation of a center to collect information on crimes committed against ethnic Ukrainians living in Russia, as well as evidence of Moscow's policy of forced Russification, political repression, and deportations. The story of a pet cat who died in freezing temperatures after a conductor threw it off a train has caused an outcry in Russia this week. Twix escaped from his travel carrier en route to St. Petersburg from Yekaterinburg when a conductor mistook him for a stray. Over 200,000 people have signed a petition calling for the conductor to be fired. Russian Railways, who operated the train, announced they would change their rules about transporting animals, and a working group will appear in the State Duma to make sure it cannot happen again. Last week, protests erupted in Russia's Republic of Bashkortostan, located near the border with Kazakhstan, following the arrest of Fayil Alsynov, a well-known local activist who was sentenced to 4 years in a penal colony on charges of inciting inter-ethnic hatred. In one of the few major protests the invasion of Ukraine made public dissent almost impossible, thousands of people came to the small town of Baymak to show their support for Alsynov and call for his release. The Kremlin-appointed leader of Bashkortostan has labelled Alsynov's supporters traitors and extremists, and even accused them of separatism. Abbas Galyamov, a Bashkir political scientist now living in exile, joins us to discuss what sparked the protests and whether we should expect more rallies soon.
You're from the Republic of Bashkortostan, which saw mass protests that made international headlines last week. How would you describe these protests? Why did they start?
Well, the most important feature which we should understand that this protest is totally different from classic liberal anti-war, anti-authoritarian protests which we had in Moscow and other big cities. This location where everything happened, the population that took part in those protests, they are like it's very remote places, something like almost 500 kilometers away from Ufa, the capital of the region. So the population that took part in the protests, it's people from deep province, villagers. The biggest so-called town, actually it's not a town, it's a big village of the area, Baymak. It's just 17,000 people. So 80% of the population there, they're ethnic Bashkirs. Half of them, they speak Russian with accent. So it's absolutely loyal population, you should understand. There was never trouble with them. So their revolt is the sensation. It's that very, what they call deep people, glubinный народ, what Putin calls, on behalf of which Putin was always speaking. He was always trying to make the opposition like those people who are against me, they are city dwellers, they are wealthy and cosmopolitan, and they are non-patriotic, but they are a tiny minority. The big majority are those people who are like struggling deep inside the country, who are loyal and who are patriotic. So he always spoke on behalf of these people, and now these people revolt. The potential of this protest, it's ethno-separatist, I would say. They already started discussing if we should live in Russia or we should secede. So far, this discussion is happening on the margin of their general discussion of what to do and who is to blame. It's not the main topic so far, but it's just so far. As soon as they realize that the authorities, they are not going to fulfill their demands, they are not going to change their course, they would start demanding secession. That's exactly how it was happening with the Soviet Union. So now this is the thing which really reminds me of how the collapse of the Soviet Union was beginning. These are the people who are not easily revolting, as I told. It's not that something really happens what they don't like and they immediately revolt. No, they're piling up things for a long time, for years and even decades. So what happened now, it's not actually because of the arrest of this activist Alsynov. This is a trigger, but not the real reason. If there had been no Alsynov, something else would have triggered the protest, because the piling up already gave the result. You should understand that Putin's course over the last quarter of a century, it was absolutely centralist. You know, Bashkirs are calling it colonialism. Like Moscow is exploring our land, is taking away our resources, and here we have just ecological problems and low-paid jobs. This is the feeling. It's really the problem that all the power is concentrated in Moscow. Local authorities, the only thing they can do is just to go to Moscow and begging for assistance, begging for part of this money which is withdrawn from the republic to be returned back to the republic to solve the needs of local population. So actually this feeling, bitter feeling of resentment that we're being exploited, it's all over Russia. You know, you have in all the territories. But in ethnic republics like Bashkortostan, you should add to this economic, the feeling of economic deprivation. You get the feeling of cultural deprivation, the feeling that local identities are being threatened, that Moscow is trying to impose its dominant imperial culture. They're trying to Russify the territory. They have the feeling that this process of Russification, Russificatia, which was the Tsarist government was undertaking back in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which led to collapse of the country during the revolution of 1917. This thing is happening again. Like back in 2017, for example, they canceled teaching local languages in local schools as a mandatory subject for local peoples. In all the ethnic republics since the 90s, since Yeltsin's reforms, it was common practice, like both Russian language and language a dominant local ethnicity was taught. Bashkir in Bashkortostan, Tatar in Tatarstan, so on. So it seemed to local population that, okay, our languages they're equal. And since 2017, no, they are no longer equal. And Moscow, Putin, they showed it. They told, no, at school, only one mandatory language, Russian. If somebody wants, let him study Bashkir. If somebody doesn't want to study Bashkir, let him not study Bashkir. With Russian, it's not like this. The Russian language is taught, it's obligatory subject. This is not obligatory. And this change in status quo led to bitter resentment among local intelligentsia, local population. And things like this are happening. And they were piling up. So these economic grievances and the feeling of being exploited, and plus these cultural grievances, the feelings that Moscow and Russians, because you should understand all those people who take care of this, they think in ethnic terms. For them, it's Russians are exploiting Bashkirs. So they came together and the pile became much bigger. And then the war came. And those people, Bashkirs, they have the feeling that it's not our war. They have the feeling that, they associate themselves more with Ukrainians than with Russians. Ukrainians are just like us. They are former colony who decided to live independently. Not a big scene. Like some of us would like the same. What Russians are calling them fascists. For what? For speaking their own language, developing their own culture. This is not a sin. This is something normal. That's exactly what we want to do, and what you would call us fascists and would start bombing us. So people in ethnic republics, I'm not speaking about 100% of population, of course. Now I'm speaking about the minority. But when the crisis, the political crisis, the ideological crisis of the Putin's Russia is going on, this minority is spreading. They're on the expansion because the void appears. Like everybody now feels that, wow, Russia is failing. Putin is failing. So something must be wrong. And the feeling of ideological crisis is obvious, and it leaves void, and the void is being filled by this ethnic sentiment. It's expanding. That's why this explosion happened. So people think, okay, why should we go and shed our blood for the sake of imperialist Moscow policy? We don't like it. So again, it was economic deprivation, cultural deprivation, and plus war. And you should understand that Bashkortostan is one of the leaders with regard to the people whom they are sending to war. It's this Khabirov who is the governor of the region. He is the leader of the region. He is perceived by local population as the Moscow appointee. He's not defending the interests of Bashkirs in the face of Moscow. It's vice versa. He came to Bashkortostan as an ambassador of Moscow interests. So he's taking Bashkir guys and sending them to war, and they're dying in mass there. And now he arrested the person who was just speaking the truth. Like, for how long are we going to tolerate it? So it was piling up, and then the explosion happened. Two things led to it. The feeling that enough is enough, and the second thing, the feeling that they are getting weaker. Like some bitter feelings about the course of the authoritarian powers is not enough to lead to an explosion. The second component is necessary. The second one is the feeling that they are losing. They're on the losing end. They're getting weaker. So it gives you the feeling that, okay, maybe now it's the moment when I should revolt. Maybe now it wouldn't be fruitless.
At the same time, the first mass protest, the most recent one, happened in Bashkortostan in 2020, before the war in Ukraine started. Does it mean that this is an explosive region for Russia?
I would say that the protests of 2020, they could have easily avoided. The local authorities, they could have easily avoided it. It was not something which was inevitable. It happened as a result of the war of local clans when the previous leader of the republic, Hamitov, it was strange. This is why he was fired from this position, substituted with Khabirov. They were struggling for power, Khabirov from Moscow and Hamitov from Bashkortostan, and trying to promote their own agendas. They both, from different angles, they were pumping this ethnic patriotism, like local ecologism. So actually, this was an artificial protest back in 2020. If they hadn't been pumping it, it wouldn't have happened. Believe me, I was conducting public opinion researches with regard to those issues which led to those protests several years prior to those protests. The issue was non-existent. It was the state propaganda that promoted it within several years. Again, from both angles, paradox. But it happened. Yes, it happened. This is now the fact. You have to live with this. So now we can tell, yes, Bashkortostan is becoming dangerous for the authorities because this trend towards displeasure with the federal colonialist attitude is already shaping up there. But you should understand, it's just a paradox of Russian politics, that it started appearing as a result of their own actions. If we speak about the result, yes, it's becoming dangerous. The danger is there.
We did not see such mass protests in other regions of Russia and in other ethnic republics recently. The rallies of this January have been the biggest protests since the start of the war. Why, despite the repressions, people in Bashkortostan are not afraid to take to the streets?
Of course they are afraid, but fear is just an emotion. And at a certain moment, this emotion can be overcome by some other emotion. The explosion happened because people had both two feelings about which I told earlier. The feeling that enough is enough. I'm not going to respect myself if I swallow up this, if I don't come out and tell them what I think about it. At certain moments of an emotional explosion, you have this feeling, which leads you, and you're getting into a fight with somebody who is much bigger and stronger. It happens. And the second feeling, that at that particular moment, they had the feeling that they are no longer so big and strong. Well, because look at the agenda in general. Russian offensive under Avdiivka obviously got stuck. Ukrainians are shooting into Russian cities like Belgrade. Obviously, the course of the war is not going in the right direction. The prices are soaring and all the people are unhappy and complaining. So those people who came out into the streets, they just felt that nobody supports the authorities. Nobody likes what is happening. They had the feeling that everyone around is against the authorities. Now this communal collapse happened. All the utilities in all the Russian cities, they are just failing. Hundreds of thousands of people all over the country are sitting without heating, without gas, in cold apartments, and it's minus 30, in some cases even more. So they're freezing. And the wives of those mobilized, they're protesting against the authorities. So the agenda in general gave the feeling that they're facing serious troubles, and there is displeasure signaled from all the corners of the country. It's like, you remember how it was happening with Chechnya back in the 90s. At that time, Chechnya was the leader of this secessionist separatist movement in Russia. They physically tried to secede and the war started. So the chief argument when they were beginning this process was bitter recollections about the Stalin's deportations, which happened 50 years before. So it seemed like 2 generations passed. It's history. No, it turned out that when the moment came, they took out this offense and presented it and started acting as if it's not history, as if it's like live politics. So you should understand that with these ethnic offenses, they have a long, very long storage, valid till, so to say. They can be stored for years and sometimes even decades. And at a certain moment when the federal center becomes weak enough, it explodes.
So do you think we should expect some separatist movements in Bashkortostan?
Definitely, separatist sentiment grew stronger. What is going to happen next depends on what the authorities will be doing next. But definitely the chances that the strong separatist movement would appear and would, at a certain moment, nobody can tell when, maybe next year, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. But now the chances that it will appear and it will happen increased.
We're now going to hear from Moscow Times journalist Leyla Latypova, who specializes in Russia's ethnic republics, about the protests in Bashkortostan, which is also her home region.
So, Leyla, these protests have hit quite close to home for you. You grew up in the Republic of Bashkortostan, and you've spent much of your career reporting on it as a journalist, researching it as an academic, and advocating for it as an activist. So how have you viewed the events that took place there last week?
As someone who has been following protest developments in Bashkortostan for several years now, I, of course, have not been surprised to see a new wave of unrest. Also because, for lack of a better comparison, protests in Bashkortostan have never stopped. They might have received less media attention because of the war in Ukraine being the main kind of thing on the agenda, but they have never stopped. And in fact, the reason for the latest protests, the underlying reason, are the mass gatherings that took place a year before that. So last year, residents of Bashkortostan's southeastern districts have came out against illegal gold mining activities that were supposed to be taking place in their native districts. And those protests, they've touched on a variety of issues. It was indigenous rights to natural resources, to taking care of and owning the land that the indigenous people of Bashkortostan, Bashkorts, have been entitled to for centuries. They have touched on, of course, on the issues of corruption, because the tenders that were issued in connection to this gold mining works, they were, of course, completely non-transparent. There have been a lot of allegations that it were people either directly, through family ties or through some other business relationships related to the republic's current governor, Radi Khabirov, etc., etc. And those protests were, in fact, quite successful. The gold mining works have been put to pause, but they essentially led to the arrest of Fayil Alsynov, who is the activist that made several very powerful speeches at those protests and have been repeatedly for more than 15 years fighting for the rights of the indigenous Bashkir population in Bashkortostan. So what we have been seeing in the Republic is continuation of that. And as we know, Fayil was later arrested. The Republic's government accused him of extremism. They claim that traces of extremist wordings were found in his speech at the protest. And essentially, that's what led to what is happening right now. I think it's important to point out that what we see in Bashkortostan is as multi-layered as what led to it, because Fayil Alsynov is, of course, famous in some circles. There are Bashkirs and also ethnic Tatars and Russians who know him from his activism, in particularly defense of Khushtaw. But I think it's important to point out that what we're seeing in Bashkortostan and the reason for these protests is as multi-layered as the events that caused them. So on one hand, there are a lot of people who know Fayil Alsynov. As I said, he has been in activism for over 15 years. He is, of course, famous in ethnic Bashkir circles, but his active role in the Khushtaw protest made him very famous among ethnic Tatars and Russians and other nationalities as well. So some people came out to support Fayil. But for many, it was another manifestation of fighting for their indigenous rights and for the rights to have a say of what is happening with their land and what is happening around them. So Fayil was just a true voice of the people, and imprisoning him was kind of this allegorical, way of showing that everyone in the Republic just needs to stay silent. So, of course, there is his personality, and then there is just a long brewing discontent with what the Kremlin-appointed government in Bashkortostan does.
So yeah, there are several threads at play here. There's the desire of people in the region to assert their own rights and, to some degree, assert their sovereignty over their own land. There's the discontent with the policies and corruption of a Moscow-installed governor, and then you have the solidarity with Alsynov himself. You mentioned the protests of 2020 to protect the ancient hill of Khushtaw, which is considered by ethnic Bashkirs to be a sacred site. Would you say these latest protests are a continuation of the 2020 protests, or are they their own movement?
No, current protests are certainly connected nearly directly with Khushtaw, but I think it's important to say that even the 1990s movement for greater sovereignty for the Republic, and in fact for secession from Russia, that was a very popular demand in the Republic in the wake of the Greater Parade of Sovereignties and collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of the rhetoric of protest of the 90s and late 1980s was also centered around environmental issues. And Bashkortostan is an economic powerhouse. It's a very resource-rich republic, one of the richest among those in Russia. So the ecological problems have always been at the forefront of what mobilizes the population. From personal accounts of family members, people who lived in Bashkortostan, they all remember growing up in the Soviet Union, experiencing this constant issues of air pollution, and particularly in Stерлитамак, where the Bashkir soda company is located. So that's the company that was going to develop the Khushtal mountain and the neighboring Shimbaisky district. There also have been a lot of deaths that were related to the development of previous hill, because Khushtal is just one of the several mountains, like limestone mountains, that are located there. Several people died because, of course, there were almost no, safety regulations followed or anything when those mountains were literally blown up to use the limestone for soda production. That all led to the question of Khushtal, which was also on the agenda of local activists as well as local government for many, many, many years before 2020 protests finally broke out. Because BSK, the Bashkir Soda Company, realized that they're going to run out of limestone to produce the baking soda. And here, I guess I should note for our listeners that many, many of them have probably seen the baking soda produced in Bashkortostan on the shelves, even European cities, because it is literally exported all over the world. And Bashkir Soda Company needed the way to continue manufacturing soda, and they didn't want to invest considerable amount of money into upgrading the equipment to allow them to mine limestone basically from area under the mountain that they already destroyed. And destroying Khushtal would be an easy way to continue to produce soda and make very large profits. So the Radi Khabirov's predecessor was very firm with his position on Khushtal. He said that the mountain would not be developed under any circumstances. So there is, in fact, this rumor that Khabirov was appointed by the Kremlin to, quote-unquote, solve the Khushtal issue, as well as solve, quote-unquote, the issue of Bashkir extremists, meaning indigenous rights activists who Kremlin has always perceived as very unruly. So Khushtal became kind of a breaking point. It mobilized a huge percent of the population. And I think it's also important to point out that those protests happened in the wake of COVID restrictions. In Russia, they were quite harsh. Nevertheless, it has united huge swaths of the population, not only ethnic Bashkirs, but also ethnic Russians, ethnic Tatars, ethnic Ukrainians, you name it. Republic has 160 nationalities living in there, and everyone was at Khushtal. So that kind of created Khushtal, it helped to solidify those networks of resistance. And of course, it made it that much easier for protesters and for civil society to mobilize last week in the wake of another injustice.
Bashkortostan is one of the regions of Russia that has been hardest hit by mobilization for the war in Ukraine. How much have these protests been fueled by resentment towards the war?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that multiple things can go on and be true at once. So we have seen that some media commentators, they label Alsynov as anti-war activist. His activism did not start with the war. It certainly continued in the wake of the war. But indigenous issues and environmental issues have always been at the forefront of his activism. So Fayil, in fact, kind of scaled down on his activist work in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and due to just this repressive machine that started working in full force. And he chose to remain in the Republic and continue his activities. So I completely understand, why he chose to do that. He did speak out against the war, though also he has done so not in expressing his kind of unequivocal support for Ukraine, but he has done so addressing his peoples who, as he said, are being sent to, quote, not their war, and are being used to do someone's bidding. And he also called the war a genocide of Bashkir people. But again, here, this aspect of protecting your own, protecting the indigenous is kind of at the forefront of his statements. And again, with these protests, it's more about the dissatisfaction with, as I said, corruption, not being able to own what is yours by the indigenous rights, etc., and etc. I'm sure frustrations with the war, they also play into it. Bashkortostan is the region with largest amount of casualties in the war in Ukraine among all in the Russia's Volga-Ural region. I believe there are nearly 2,000 confirmed deaths from the Republic. And from what we've seen, we don't have any clear data, but from what independent analysts have been able to gather, it is also the ethnic Bashkir districts of Bashkortostan that have the largest number of casualties within the Republic. And Baymak district, where the protests took place, is one of them.
So these were certainly some of the largest protests that we've seen in Russia since the start of the war. And we're already starting to see repressions against those who took part in them and organized them. Our other guest for this episode, Abbas Galyamov, said the suppression of these protests will fuel separatist sentiment in the region. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
Well, today, as we're recording it, independent local news outlets have confirmed over 50 arbitrary detentions and arrests in the Republic. But to me, what I think is more fascinating is multiple locals and activists who I spoke with. Their spirits are not crushed and, they're ready for even more protests to happen. I wouldn't link what is happening in Bashkortostan to quote unquote separatist feelings. In fact, I think that would be premature to say if that would lead to any separatism. And it doesn't always. And B, I think that just acts, and as a lot of activists have been saying, to kind of discredit the protesters, because that is not what they are demanding. That's not what they're asking for. Some of those in the Republic that I spoke with, they're very crushed by being labeled extremists and separatists by not only their own government, but also independent observers. And they say that, no, we have never had an intention of separating from Russia. A lot of them say that they see themselves as part of the federation, but at the same time, they want to have the rights that belong to them.
You mentioned you've spoken with activists and other people inside the Republic in the days since the protest. So how would you describe the current mood among people in Bashkortostan today?
From everything that people have told me, it's a very interesting mixture of fear, anger, and frustration. So that's why most of the people who I spoke with, they don't rule out further protests. Because on one hand, as one local in Baymak told me, people have literally seen this politics storming into their houses. That's meaning the way all of these arbitrary detentions and arrests have been working. And it's small villages, about 200 people in Baymak, when suddenly some unknown police car, clearly not from a local police department, rolls in. And men who they've never seen before start knocking on everyone's doors and taking local men, working men from their homes and arresting them. So that, of course, scared them, but also people say that they feel abandoned by their own government because no one, even local officials, meaning, district level officials, they haven't come out to speak with the people. So that's also a huge source of frustration. And I think outside of Baymak, anger and the will to fight further prevails because the repressions, of course, have been concentrated mostly in that district for now and also against very well-known activists. So we are awaiting for an appeal hearing on Fayil Alsynov's case, and that will take place at the Republic's higher court in Ufa. And of course, everyone expects that more people will come out also because it's the capital, it's easier to reach than Baymak. So I think Bashkorts and Bashkortostanis are ready to fight.
That's all for this episode. Thank you for listening to Russia on the Record, and be sure to follow the Moscow Times on social media to catch future episodes.